Hey everybody, today we're going to be cooking Czech Guláš, one of my favorite dishes of all time. This dish has a long history in Czech Republic and in Central Europe. It's one of those dishes that's a staple, and yet there seem to be just as many variations on this dish as there are people and or countries in the world. You can find it made many different ways. What you're about to see is the way that I learned how to make it using a few different techniques, but I followed a few recipes first, and it was so close to how I remembered it tasting in Prague and around the Czech Republic that I, over a period of months and years, have tweaked it to get it just how I wanted it. Now, the first time I had this was back in 1999 when I lived in the Czech Republic, and I remember it very fondly. And so that nostalgia is something that I've really tried to recapture inside this dish. And as I've gone back over the years, and most recently this year, had it again, I try to have it at least once every time I visit. And I think that this is the closest I've ever gotten to capturing the essence of my favorite restaurants. The key element to this entire recipe happens at the very beginning. I take 3 onions, 4 tablespoons or scoops of lard, and we cook those until they start going dark brown. Now, not all the onions will be dark brown, but you'll see them in many of them. I've done it a bunch of different ways, and as long as you're starting to get there, it usually works out pretty well. Partway in to actually doing this, frying the onions in the lard, you dump in the caraway seeds. You crush them up first. That releases some of the flavor, and then you dump it in and you mix it up, and as it fries, that flavor really does get infused with the onions. Now, I would say it's really important to either use lard, or I guess some oil might work for this as well. Don't use butter when frying the onions. Part of the issue is we're going to be frying them long enough that the butter would start to burn, and you'd burn the bottom of the pan, and it would really add a bitter taste to the overall end food. With the lard, you're able to cook the onions longer and really cook them down and caramelize them without burning anything, because the lard continues to cook and cook just like oil. So use something that's not going to burn if you cook it for a long time. The onion part for me is one of the most important parts of the whole thing. It's what allows you to get the flavor, and it gives you the character, and it gives you the really dark flavor, the dark color to the end goulash. So don't skimp on onions, don't skimp on the lard, and make sure that you take it further than probably you normally would take it when you're just cooking onions. Once you have that done, we're going to take it off the heat for a little while. Let it cool down a little bit. Let that kind of solidify before turning it back on, adding the meat and all of the other elements. That's really the whole thing. Now, the meat, we're using beef, and you can use any kind of stew meat that you have access to. There's really no written rule. I've gone out and got shank, which is amazing flavor. Shank is actually a really tough meat that you have to cook long time at low temperatures to soften up. And the parts of that which make it so tough end up cooking out. And that's one of the things that thickens up the overall goulash. And so we're not using flour or bread or anything like that to thicken it up. The thickener really comes from the meat cooking for so long at a low temperature, and also the onions, and that's why we don't skimp. So typically what we want to do is a 1-to-1 ratio for the meat to onions, but I typically use 1.5 pounds or so of meat and 3 medium to large onions. And as long as it's approximately like that, the results have turned out really well. When you put the meat in, you're going to put it in the onions and stir it up a lot of the natural juices come out, and then it starts to brown. And so many cookbooks say do it until it's golden, and I don't ever remember seeing any meat ever looking golden, but it does have kind of a brownish hue that could be like a little bit golden. And you just do it until you can tell that it's evenly seared all around it, and that it's cooked the outside, but you're not overcooking it or actually cooking it all the way through at all. You just want to really take some of that juice out and make sure the outer exterior part of the meat is all cooked. That's when we put all the spices in. That's when we put everything in. We've got 3 to 4 tablespoons of sweet Hungarian paprika. You can use any variation on that. I've seen all of them used, but that's what I'm doing. And it's about a teaspoon of salt and a teaspoon of pepper all mixed together. We've got the tomato paste, and I just eyeball a couple squirts. It's about 2 tablespoons, I would guess. So I use 2 boxes of beef broth in this recipe. I don't go any more than that, even though when you're cooking it with the lid off, you will reduce it beyond 2 boxes over the course of 4 to 5 hours. So what I'll typically do is put in the first one, the whole thing, just cover up the whole thing. The other thing we put in right at the beginning are bay leaves, just a staple for this. And anywhere between 2 and 4, I have right now bigger ones, and so I'm just using 2, but if I get small ones, then I'm using 3 or 4, and we mix those in all together. Put it on simmer so that it just is simmering for the first hour. About 30 to 45 minutes in, I'll top it off. And another 30 to 45 minutes after that, I'll top it off out of the second box. And then on the third time, I usually finish off the box. At that point, I'll reduce it until it's maybe just slightly more fluid than I want it to be for the end thing, just slightly. And then I'll put the lid on. I'll probably, because I'm on a bigger burner for most of it, I'll put it on one of the smaller burners at a low temperature, just so we have the slightest simmering, because with the lid on, it keeps it warmer, and it will boil if you leave it on a big burner. But I'll put it on one of the small ones, just let it barely bubble for the next hour, hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. Most of the liquid will stay in at that point. And so with the lid on, if it's a good lid. And so you want to definitely do that, but check it every once in a while just to make sure it's not reducing more than you want. So you have all of that, those different elements. You end up with that. It's the right texture, the right amount of fluid. At the very end, we take our marjoram and we roll it in our hands and dump it in the goulash. And then we stir it up a little bit, and that's the end of the recipe.